Muchísimas gracias, Sara, por tu moderación. Y, quisiera agradecer a Alfonso Martínez Echeverría. Nos conocimos en Oxford y por eso, solamente por eso, él cree que puedo hablar inglés y estar en un panel internacional. Entonces, doble gracias. Thank you, Mrs. Chairwoman. Special thanks to Alfonso Martínez Echeverría for the great success of this meeting and for inviting me in my beloved Spain. So on February 23 this year, the European Commission adopted a proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on corporate sustainability due diligence, and amending Directive EU 2019-1937. In particular, the proposal aims to harmonize existing national or voluntary rules on due diligence by establishing a corporate sustainability due diligence duty to address negative human rights and environmental impact. As we know, the initiative of the European Union is based on several studies written by scholars and experts, definitely condensed into the 2020 final report issued by Ernst & Young on directors' duties and sustainable corporate governance. A third of companies recognize the need to act and take measures to address adverse effects on their actions on human rights or the environment. In a wider sense, everyone understands that business plays a key role in creating a sustainable and fair economic and society. Nations have tried to face such matters by improving autonomous and domestic tools on corporate sustainability-related due diligence obligations. But standalone measures are not enough to help companies and sustainability. The theoretical frame in which the proposal could be included takes inspiration from the recent approaches to financial crisis that are mostly based on the consideration of short-term capitalism, the so-called quarterly capitalism, as the bad perspective. And on the other side, the long-termism as the best way to sustainability and growth. As Professor Mark Roy from Harvard University says, increasingly rapid stock trading and sharply rising activist pressure on public firms led to pernicious economy-wide results. And the same Professor Mark Roy says that there is no evidence. There is no convincing economic evidence supporting the short-termism thesis. In any case, the European Union thinks that short-termism has serious adverse economic effects on companies, their shareholders, and their stakeholders. As a result, companies risk to become less productive and innovative in the long term, with adverse consequences on the sustainability of the company as well as for the local and global economy as a whole. So that, for an assumed equivalence, the medicine is the long-termism. That is to say, a view of the business that can be considered nearly 10 years long, and for this reason can involve the corporate business and its value chain in keeping the interest of the employees and customers, the interest of local and global environment, the interest of society at large. So the proposal provides for the obligation for the companies to take care of aspects related to ESG issues with particular regards to human rights, such as child labor, exploitation of workers, environment, in order to contain and eliminate pollution and protect the biodiversity. In particular, this directive will improve corporate governance practices to better integrate risk management and mitigation process of human rights, environmental risk and impacts, including those stemming from value chains into corporate strategies. The second issue is avoid fragmentation of due diligence requirements in the single market and create legal certainty for business and stakeholders. Moreover, increase corporate accountability for adverse impacts. Improve access to remedies for those affected by adverse human rights and environmental impacts of corporate behavior. And finally, being a horizontal instrument, focusing on business processes, applying also to the value chain. This directive will complement other measures in force or proposed which directly address some specific sustainability challenges or apply in some specific sectors, mostly within the Union. The new diligence rules, which will offer companies legal certainty and a level playing field with a view to greater transparency for investors, divide their recipients into two groups. First, companies resident in a European Union member state, divided in turn into two subgroups. The first, which includes companies with more than 500 employees and a worldwide net turnover greater than euro 150 million. The second, which includes other companies operating in certain sectors with high impact, environmental, social, with more than 250 employees and a worldwide net turnover equal to or greater than 40 million. Companies, the second, companies from third countries, active in the European Union, with a threshold of turnover generated in the European Union in line with Group 1 or Group 2. The proposal aimed to promote sustainable and responsible corporate behavior, providing for the obligation for companies to identify and, if necessary, avoid, stop, or mitigate the negative impacts of their operations, of the operation of their subsidiaries, and the operations along the so-called supply chain, on the social, environmental, and economic fabric. In particular, the directors of the companies to which the proposal is addressed will have the obligation to integrate the company strategies in order to pursue the ESG objectives in the long term by monitoring, inter alia, the effectiveness of the policies and the due diligence measures. On the other hand, the national administrative authorities designated by the member states will be responsible for monitoring the application on the mentioned new rules and, where necessary, sanctioning the same companies if they do not comply with the provisions of the proposal for a directive. This issue is very important to understand how the new rules have to be imported in the home country legislation and what could be the options available for the lawmakers. The rule of directors' duties are enforced through existing member states' laws. The directive does not include an additional enforcement regime in case directors do not comply with their obligations under this directive. But on the side of compensation of victims of adverse impacts, member states should be required to lay down rules governing the civil liability of companies for damages arising due to its failure to comply with the due diligence process. The company should be liable for damages if they failed to comply with the obligations to prevent and mitigate potential adverse impacts or to bring actual impacts to an end and minimize their extent. And as a result of this failure and adverse impact that should have been identified, prevented, mitigated, brought to an end or its extent minimized through the appropriate measures occurred and led to the damage. In order to ensure that victims of human rights and environmental harms can bring an action for damages and claim compensation for damages arising due to a company's failure to comply with the due diligence obligations stemming from this directive, even where the law applicable to such claims is not the law of a member state. So we can say that the duties coming from the proposal are addressed to the companies and their directors for the following concrete actions. The first one is integrating due diligence into policies and management systems. The second, identifying and assessing adverse human rights and environmental impacts. The third, preventing, seizing, or minimizing actual and potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts. The fourth, assessing the effectiveness of measures. The fifth, communicating. The sixth, providing remediation. As everyone can see, such scheme reflects the so-called COSO report. The COSO report standard given by the Pricewaterhouse in 1990s. That is to say, the widely known tool to be used for monitoring companies' risks. As it happened with the internal control systems, the non-financial informations, and the capital requirements, the European Union is going to try to harmonize company law by taking inspiration from the bank and the financial sectors, where such issues are since a long time faced and ruled. The improvement of the directive shall be based on specific requirements that in general should not modify the legal structure, civil liability system of each member state. In this perspective, the proposal regulates sustainability due diligence obligation of companies and at the same time covers, to the extent linked that the due diligence, corporate directors' duties and corporate management system to implement due diligence. Thus, the proposal concerns processes and measures for the protection of interests of the members and the stakeholders of the companies. The existing member state rules and those under preparation already have and would further lead to diverging requirements, which risk being inefficient and leading to an uneven playing field. Large companies will be within the scope of the full due diligence obligation, also because many of them already have certain processes in place. The proposal lays down measures to limit the passing on of the burden from those large companies, but each state will be free to adopt the appropriate legal tool to improve such diligence obligations. In this sense, according to the model of civil liability provided by our legal systems, companies should not be liable for failing to prevent or seize harm at the level of indirect business relationships if they used contractual cascading and assurance and put in place measures to verify compliance with it, unless it was unreasonable in the circumstances of the case to expect that the action actually taken, including as regards verifying compliance, would be adequate to prevent, bring to an end, or minimize the extent of adverse impact. If so, the traditional balance between the business judgment rule and the duty of care that is represented by the edge of fraud and conflict of interests has to be redetermined when speaking of companies under the new diligence obligation. In this sense, such companies shall produce a specific output that is a procedure, that is a review, an output aimed to prove that the obligation of preventing potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts have been observed. In case of missing output, the obligation would be considered as violated. But in case of presence of such output, its quality, effectiveness, and efficiency could be considered as inappropriate or inadequate. Finally, of course, directors should therefore be responsible for putting in place and overseeing the due diligence actions as laid down in the proposal and for adopting the company's due diligence policy, taking into account the input of stakeholders and civil society organizations and integrating due diligence into corporate management systems. Directors should also adapt the corporate strategy to actual and potential impacts identified, any due diligence measures taken. If we take a look at the main European legal systems, the continental ones, of course, we will see that the duty of care is now more detailed than it was according to the parameter of the prudent administrator. In Belgium, for example, according to the Belgian measure, directors will be personally liable to the company for any damage resulting from his failure to act as a prudent manager. In France, each director owes individual duties to the company to promote the success of the company for the benefits of its shareholders as a whole and must act in good faith. In Germany, each director has a general obligation to act with the diligence of a prudent business person. In Italy, directors must fulfill their obligation with the diligence required by the nature of their duties and their specific competences. Since 2019, in Italy, all companies have been obliged to set up and maintain organizational, accounting, and administrative measures adequate to the nature and the size of their business, to promptly direct any signs of an emerging crisis. This is a typical way of giving obligational substance to a general duty of conduct. In Spain, if I can, si es permito, directors have a general duty of diligence for the good management and the control of the company. Directors are required to act in good faith, without personal interest in the matter that is under decision, with sufficient information and in accordance with an appropriate decision process. So, in a few words, I think that the new due diligence would be considered as a mandatory specification of the general duty of care. On this point, yesterday I listened to the opinion of Professor Ureba that was partially different. I don't think that it was deepened. It was deepened the argument, but he said that the due diligence is a specification of the duty of loyalty. Yesterday he said this, and this could be a very important point to be deepened. But this is, I think that this is a fiduciary duty, requiring directors and officers of a corporation to make decisions that pursue the corporation's interests with reasonable diligence and prudence, or the duty by which a corporate director or officer is required to perform their functions in a manner that they reasonably believe to be in the best interest of the corporation. Such general duty of care is now moreover specified into a concrete duty of adopting the company's due diligence policy, taking into account the input of stakeholders and civil society organizations and integrating due diligence into corporate management systems. This way, we can say that directors will be responsible on two levels. The one of the lack of such policies and procedures, and the one of their inadequacy. The second one is probably the most important and interesting. And from this point of view, we have to deeply, deeply study. Thank you for your attention.